Kelley Richardson. Today I'm at ABQ Sewing Studios in Strathroy, Ontario, and I am so excited to bring you my second video in the series on sewing machine feet. What are they for and how do they work? There are so many sewing machine feet available for your machines nowadays, it is sometimes very difficult to know which foot is the right one for the job at hand. Quite a few sewers and quilters, I know, have a lot of feet that they just don't use because they don't really know what they are for or how to use them properly. The right foot can make the job so much easier, more accurate, and therefore so much more enjoyable. Anything that can make your sewing look more professional with less ripping is worth it. My hobby of quilting and sewing certainly takes me to my happy place and is something I look forward to, unless I have one of those days where I spend more time ripping my stitches out than I did putting them in. That is just no fun at all. The right foot can make all the difference. I'm hoping this video and blog series will help you take the mystery out of your sewing machine feet and perhaps give you the confidence to try something new. And of course, help take you to your happy place. On today's installment, we are going to talk about walking feet, or even feet as they are commonly referred to. There are a couple of different types or kinds of walking feet, but they all basically do the same job. They are made to feed evenly multiple layers of fabric. So when you are quilting, you will definitely want to use your walking foot. And they are not just for straight line quilting anymore. You can do straight line quilting, you can do gentle curves, and you can even use some of your decorative stitches to add a little bit more interest to your quilting stitches. So now this one right here, this is probably the most common one that you're going to see. They have a fairly large body. They might have a little bit different configuration, but they're basically the same. They have a activation lever, and what that activation lever does, see how it activates this little part right here? Well, that part right there acts as a set of feed dogs feeding your fabric from the top while your feed dogs are taking care of the fabric from the bottom. Kind of picture it as a great big dog with jaws chomping, and you're feeding from the top and the bottom at the same time. That is what this foot does. Now, the majority of these feet have a zigzag sole plate on them so that you're able to do your zigzag stitch, or you can move your needle position over so that you can get some perfect stitch in the ditch going on. Some of the feet also have interchangeable sole plates so that you could have, let's say, a stitch in the ditch foot or a 1/4 inch foot with a guide and attach that to your walking foot so that you can quilt with that one as well. This particular foot that I have here does not have interchangeable sole plates. It just has the standard zigzag. So let's take a look and see how that works. When you are using this foot, you actually will be taking your ankle completely off. So use your screwdriver, undo the screw that's on the left side of the bar there, and remove your foot. Now this is considered the ankle, and the ankle is the part that your feet attach to. So take that right off. When you are putting on your walking foot, the most important thing you need to remember is that this bar right here, now on some feet it'll just be a straight bar. This particular foot has a U-shaped piece. That needs to go around the needle bar. Now this is your needle bar, so on every machine it is the place where your needle screw is. If you need to replace your needle, you would undo this screw to replace the needle. That is what this needs to go around or sit on top of if it just happens to be the straight bar. What that does is as your needle is going up and down, it will then activate that second set of feed dogs to give you the even feed that we need. Okay, there. I have attached this foot, and you'll notice that the arm is going around my needle bar, which is the most important thing to remember on this foot. Now, this particular type of walking foot is somewhat model specific, although there are a lot of generic ones out there that work. The most important thing if you're buying a generic foot, not specifically made for your model of sewing machine, is to make sure that when you have the foot on, that of course it makes contact with your feed dogs, but also that the needle comes right down in the very center of the foot. All right, I have a little bit of a quilt here to show you how some of this might work. All right, so when I am using this foot, generally when I'm quilting, straight line quilting, I want to put maybe a slightly bigger stitch length than what the machine defaults to. This particular machine defaults to a 2.5 millimeter stitch, and I generally like to quilt with a little bit bigger stitch. Not huge, you know, we don't want a toe catcher, but a little bit bigger. And part of the beauty of this foot is because your feed dogs are up, all your stitches are going to be the same size. All right, so one of the things that I always do whenever I'm quilting is I want to bring that bobbin thread up to the top, so I have control of that bobbin thread. If I don't bring it up to the top, it'll get all tangled up underneath, and then I got little bird's nests that I have to pick out later, and we just don't like doing that. So I'm going to hang on to my top thread right out of the needle. I'm going to do a needle down, needle up, and I'm going to bring up that bobbin thread right to the top there so that I have control over that. There we go. All right. And I also always like to sew, when I'm quilting, I want my needle to be in the down position so that when I stop, the needle is going to stop in the down position. Now, as you can see, I've drawn a line on here. I hope you can see that. I've drawn a line on here with just some Fons and Porter white chalk, and I am going to try doing some stitch in the ditch. So off we go. And what I'm looking for is I'm not watching the needle go up and down, because it's going to go up and down whether I look at it or not. What I'm looking for is to make sure that my line is going directly in the middle, so that my needle is hitting that line all the time. Now, the walking foot, speed is not necessarily your friend when you're sewing with a walking foot. So if you are one of those sewers that sews at top speed all the time, you might find you have to slow down just a little bit. I'm not saying you have to poke like a bunny or a turtle, but you don't want to go top speed. So here we go. There we are. There. So that helps guide you right directly onto the line. Gives you a little bit bigger stitch. That's my 3 millimeter stitch that I was talking about in the beginning. Okay. Now, some of the other things that you can do with this foot that are just so much fun. You can do gentle curves the exact same way. Just either trace a gentle curve on, and you can sew with a gentle curve, but you can also use some of those very cool decorative stitches that you have on your sewing machine to add just a wee bit more interest to your quilting. Okay, there's a couple of things you want to keep in mind when you're choosing a decorative stitch to quilt with. You want to make sure that it is a stitch that doesn't go back on itself. Some stitches go, forward, back, 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 forward, back. Those types of stitches are not necessarily the best with your walking foot, because your walking foot doesn't do reverse really, really well. It'll be okay for doing little back stitching or for adhering your seams, but it doesn't like to go back a whole lot. So what I've chosen here is just a simple feather stitch. It has a definitive center point, so I just make sure that I'm following along my line, and then on we go. And you let the feed dogs do their job. You're just guiding, and all I'm doing is I'm looking ahead of the foot to make sure that my line is going into the center of the foot. There we go. There. Now, that is a cute little stitch that can add a little bit extra interest to your quilting. Another one of the very cool features of this particular foot is quite often it comes with this thing here called a guide bar. What this allows us to do is to just mark one line on our quilt, and we use the guide bar to sew in all the subsequent lines. Now I know when I'm teaching a beginning machine quilting class, this little fellow right here gets people very excited because it cuts down on the amount of time it's going to take for you to quilt your quilt, because it cuts out all the marking. So the first thing you do, it usually snaps into the back of your foot. There we go, like that one. So if I decide that I want to do, let's say, a 1-inch crosshatch, I will put this in. I will measure from my needle to where my foot is. Right about there, maybe just a wee titch more. Okay, so my guide bar now is exactly 1 inch away from my needle. And my very first line, I will just mark the very first line on the quilt. And I'm going to sew that line in, so I'm looking out here about 1 inch or so ahead of the foot, and I'm sewing in that first line. Now each subsequent line, I just have to move over without doing any marking at all. I'll put that down, so I'm lining the guide bar up with this line that I previously sewed, and I'm looking over here, but I'm sewing over there. So I'm watching right here, making sure that I'm leading that line into the guide bar, like that. And I can just move over again. So this particular feature is a huge time saver, because it saves me from having to mark all those lines on my quilt. I just keep on sewing. So if you're just doing a whole bunch of straight lines, or if you're looking to do a crosshatch, this part right here is just amazing. Now, if I'm doing a diagonal crosshatch, all I need to do is mark an X on my quilt. Let's see if you can see, I have that X marked on the quilt there. That is the only marking that I need to do. Then I'll go ahead and sew all the subsequent lines. Usually I do all one direction first, and then I swap and I will go in the other direction. And there you can see, got a pretty nice looking crosshatch there in a fraction of the time, because it eliminates the step of you having to mark your quilt. The best thing about this foot is that it evenly feeds your fabrics, so that you're not going to have any of those nasty puckers or pleats on the underside when you're finished with your quilting. So anytime that I'm quilting something with layers, I want to put this foot on. I quite often use it if I'm doing my binding, when I'm applying that. If I'm also sewing weird fabrics, like slippery fabrics, I will quite often put my walking foot on, even when I'm using knit sometimes. So it's not just for quilting. Okay, this next type of walking foot I want to talk about, this is a digital dual feed. It actually plugs into the machine, and when it does something like that, it changes a lot of the settings on your machine. It will gray out any of the stitches that you cannot do with this foot, so it takes some of the guesswork out of your settings. It also has the interchangeable sole plates on it, so they just snap on and off nice and easy, so you can change which foot you're using, whether you have the stitch in the ditch one that gives you the little sticky downy bit there to keep you in the ditch. It also has a mechanism on the side. Well, let me just take this off here, so you can see that it will disengage or engage the dual feed. So if you happen to be doing some sewing and you don't want to change your foot, but you don't need the dual feed, you can actually disengage it and just continue sewing without the dual feed engaged. You'll also notice that the rubber, like we talked about before, it has a rubber belt. Now the rubber belt maintains constant contact with the fabric, and you'll see that in just a second when I show you how it works, as opposed to the regular dual feed that we just looked at, where the top set of feed dogs constantly chomp down on your bottom set of feed dogs. So let's see how this one works. You attach it very similar to your machine. You drop your ankle and take your ankle and your foot off. The biggest difference is there is nothing that needs to rest on top of the needle bar, because the foot doesn't operate that way. And you also have to plug this one in. Okay, let's watch this one in action. There, I just increased the stitch length just a little bit. So see how it's maintaining constant contact with the fabric as opposed to jumping up and down like the other one does. It's nice and quiet. And because I can very quickly change the feet, it's a handy little fella to have. Okay, so let's take a look at our final option. Now, this particular machine has the built-in walking foot. This one happens to be an older model FAF, and they call it the IDT system. They aren't the only machines that have the built-in walking foot system, but I'm pretty sure they're the first ones that came out with it. I might be wrong, so don't quote me on that. How the IDT system, or the built-in walking foot system, works is this little lever right here clips down into place, and it clips so that it's slightly underneath the foot. You can kind of see it there. It's a little bit underneath the foot. Now, it does require special feet that, of course, come with the machine. It has a cutout, and that is where the IDT system pushes down on the fabric. Let's just put that foot back on, and we'll show you how this works. Now, one thing of note, when you are engaging this particular system, your foot does need to be in the up position, and the IDT system snaps in, and then you can put your foot down. When you're disengaging the system, you also have to have your foot in the up position, and it just gets pushed this way. So as you can see, let's put a little quilt under here. Watch that. See that? How that bar is walking and pushing down on the fabric. Maybe if I get my fingers out of the way. Now here's a few tips that I hope will make it a little bit easier for you when you're using your walking foot. It doesn't matter which one you use, what machine you have, as long as the foot you have fits your machine properly, whether it's specific to that particular model or it's a generic, but you've made sure that it fits. You also want to be in as ergonomically correct a position as you possibly can to relieve some strain on your shoulders. I know a lot of people, especially when they first start quilting, it starts to get really sore in between their shoulder blades or up the back of their neck, because they're kind of, first of all, pretty tense because they're learning a new skill, but also they're a little bit hunched over. So when I'm at setting up my sewing space, what I want to do is either have the machine sink down into the table, if at all possible, so that it is at the absolute correct height. I don't have that option myself at home. I sew on a regular standard table. So I like to have a chair that allows me to actually raise myself higher, so that when I'm sewing at the sewing machine, my hands aren't in this position. They're more in a 90-degree position, so I can be a lot more relaxed. My shoulders are down. That way I can sew for a much longer period. You will find that if you get yourself into a comfortable position, you'll be able to sew an awful lot longer with less aches and pains. I know sometimes when I'm sewing, I get sewing and I totally lose track of time. And then, you stand up after a while and like everything hurts. So you want to try to minimize that as much as you possibly can. Another point is the quilt position. When I am quilting, I make sure that the majority of the weight of the quilt is up on my table. When I'm quilting, there is nothing else on the table with the exception of my quilt. And let's face it, as I'm moving my quilt around, anything that's on the table is going to hit the floor anyway, so I might as well take it off beforehand. I want to make sure that I don't have any downward pressure on the quilt. So, for example, if the quilt is sitting in my lap or hanging down off the table, that's a lot of extra pressure you're putting on that walking foot. So if you have your quilt up, either put it up on your chest so that the quilt is going in this way as opposed to coming up this way, you will find that the walking foot just performs a whole lot better. If you're sewing along and everything's looking fine and all of a sudden you're taking these teeny weeny little stitches, it's probably that there's just too much drag on the quilt and your walking foot can't pull it up. So just adjust, pull the quilt up so that it's going into the foot this way, and that will give you your desired results. I hope you've enjoyed this video on dealing with your walking foot. I look forward to our next video, and I will see you again. Until then, take care, be kind to one another, and have a wonderful day. Happy sewing!